Hello and welcome back. This is the fifth in a series of 8 short video tutorials demonstrating how Veggie Compass can be used to give small and mid-scale horticultural farmers a much fuller picture of their farm finances than traditional record-keeping systems provide. Whether you actually decide to use Veggie Compass yourself is not as important as learning the concepts this tool helps us demonstrate. These tutorials are designed to be viewed in order, chronologically, so if you've stumbled into the middle of the series, you'll want to go back and start at the beginning. In this tutorial, we will introduce 3 important concepts on how to manage for profitability by 1. Breaking out production costs by major activity areas, 2. Breaking out production costs by crop, and 3. Understanding the true costs of production labor. So far, all your farm expenses and income have been entered into the previous 2 spreadsheets. Now comes possibly the most difficult part of all, but trust me, it's worth it. This production input spreadsheet is where you enter the costs associated with the actual production or growing of each of your crops. Again, at first that sounds simple, but quickly I found out I had very little real data to enter into this sheet when I first used Veggie Compass. The records that you'll find useful in filling out this sheet include your seed invoices, greenhouse records, labor records including time cards, crop journals where you're tracking field activities, and your crop planning records. The creators of Veggie Compass thought long and hard about how to describe and break down the cost of producing crops. They determined to split up the cost of production into 3 main activity areas: greenhouse production, field growing, and harvest and pack. Thinking about production by these activity areas offers you a new way to assess and manage your production practices. Looking at the specific activity areas like this will help you analyze where money could be saved or where you might gain some efficiency to maximize your profits. For example, it could be a real breakthrough for you to think about harvest, wash, and pack, those systems by themselves on your farm, separate from your field growing activities. We'll show you why in the next tutorial. It turns out that the biggest cost of production on almost any vegetable farm is the input called labor. So knowing how that labor budget is being spent is critical to managing for profits. Veggie Compass asks you to break out your production labor bill into these 3 production activity areas. Not many of us have this level of detail in our labor records. Certainly I didn't. So this was my first wake-up call to start collecting more and better labor data on my farm. Let's look at the sample spreadsheet. You'll notice the crop list in column A, same as before, and the unit of measure in column B that have automatically been brought over by Veggie Compass from the sales input sheet. The first section of this production input sheet asks for seed costs per crop and then the number of plants, if any, that were grown in your farm greenhouse. You were reminded on the previous sheet, on the expense input page, that purchased transplants go into the seed cost column. They are not a greenhouse expense, so they do not go in column D. Column E is where you record the actual area grown for each of your crops. But first, you must choose the unit of measure. Put your cursor on cell E5 and follow the directions in the comment box. You'll see a little arrow in the bottom right corner. Click on that, and there are your choices: acres, row feet, or square feet. I use the acre unit, but smaller growers may be more comfortable with the row feet or square feet unit. Columns F and G comprise the field growing components of production. Column F is for putting total labor hours by crop. Yep, this is all the hours you and your team worked doing actual non-greenhouse and non-harvest farm work on a crop. Man, who has records like that? It's going to take some head scratching for most of you to figure this out. Here's a suggestion. Sit and think about all the steps that go into your production. Tilling, spreading compost, transplanting, irrigating, cultivating, mulching, etc. Think about how long it takes to do each one of these steps for some given unit of land, say an acre or maybe a 100-foot bed. Don't forget how long it takes to set up and take off implements on your tractor and travel time to the field. For instance, I take about 2 hours per acre to spread compost and to spade the soil to get ready for planting. Also, it takes us about 3 labor hours, people hours, per acre to lay black plastic mulch. Now, you'll have a set of standards to use to account for all the field activities for each crop. Richard Wiswall's book, titled The Organic Farmer's Business Handbook, contains the most complete explanation and demonstration of how to account for production costs that I've ever seen. This is some slow and tedious work to think through all of it, but without this information, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle that will determine your farm finances. Next, in column G, is where you input non-labor, crop-specific field costs. Those are field production costs that go into growing a crop aren't labor, like tomato twine or drip tape. For supplies that are used for several crops, like drip tape, this can take a little bit of figuring to get the cost per crop. Sure, you know that you spent $1,000 on drip tape, but how does that translate per crop? On my farm, one common example is the cost of putting down black plastic mulch with drip tape underneath and then having hay mulch between the aisles, between the rows in the aisles. I figured out that cost per acre and then have prorated each crop where we use that practice. Columns H and I are for the harvest and pack costs for each crop, both labor and non-labor. Just as before, most of us do not have labor hours for picking, packing, and washing our vegetables at all, let alone by individual crop. I've put some comments in this section that indicate metrics that I've gleaned mostly from the Roxbury Farm Manual. Some of it is from my own experience or the experience of my neighbors. This harvest manual is a great resource, and a link to it can be found on the Growing Farm Profits course section at the Southern SOG website. After my first brush with Veggie Compass in 2011, I got excited to know more about the labor costs on my farm. So I created a new time card for my crew that tracked those 3 main farm activities that Veggie Compass uses: growing crops, production, harvesting, washing, and packing crops, and marketing crops. A sample of this time card can be found in the Growing Farm Profits course section at the Southern SOG website. There's also some other record-keeping forms and a Google Doc instructional video available at the Veggie Compass website. Using that new tie card allowed me to learn exactly how many hours I was paying for each of those different work activities. For this production input sheet, I now know that I paid for 4,562 hours for people to harvest and pack vegetables. From there, I had to distribute those hours amongst the crops. So for each crop, I sat and imagined the process of harvest and pack and came up with an idea of what I think it should take to harvest either a basket or a crate or a bunch. So then I multiplied this rate times the number of units that I know we'd harvested, and then I entered that as the labor spent. This is all to say that until you collect the data on your farm, what you input here is only a guess. So do your best using other people's numbers, your own intuition, and any quick field calculations you can come up with to get these labor numbers more accurate. As for non-labor supply costs involved with harvest and pack that go here in column I have very few. We don't use clamshells or expensive labels or twist ties, but many growers do, and this is where those costs would go. As for harvest containers themselves, the bushels, the crates, the baskets that we use over and over again, season in and season out, I consider these part of the general cost of farming. Without containers to harvest into, there will be no harvesting. But if a certain channel requires a very specific container for delivery, say a 1-bushel wax box for wholesale or reusable bags for CSA, then those costs should be attributed to those specific market channels back on the expense input sheet under supplies. As in the previous sales input sheet, there's a special box to the far right over here in columns J and K to collect special data that is used in the next sheets to make important calculations. First, in cell K5 is the total number of labor hours spent in the greenhouse. Most of us don't record the time we or our workers spend in the greenhouse, but again, a good grower knows his or her system well enough to be able to think through those activities over the course of the season and make a pretty good guess of how much time was spent doing greenhouse work. You might try keeping a notebook at the door of the greenhouse as a simple way to record hours in the future. Veggie Compass will take these greenhouse hours, labor hours, and spread them over the crops grown based on the number of plants of each crop that's grown in the greenhouse. In cell K8, the next blue box, the total number of non-crop specific hours spent field growing is entered. Okay, what are we talking about? This is where you put all of those hours that you're pretty sure were spent out in the field working, but you can't say exactly which crop the time was spent on, or it was some kind of field activity that is not crop specific. Some of this labor may be spent on things that are done for the whole farm, like installing a new irrigation supply line, or building a fence, or mowing the grass around the fields. But sometimes it's just hours that are untracked because we have imperfect labor records. Who has great ones? Not very many people. That's why this box is here. The next box down in blue in cell K11 is titled Total Non-Crop Specific Hours Spent on Harvest and Pack. Okay, you ask again, what are we talking about? This number should account for the labor spent on activities that are done for the whole farm, not for one specific crop, like disinfecting harvest baskets or gathering supplies in the morning before heading out to harvest, or cleaning and disinfecting the washing and packing area. To get these total non-crop specific hours spent on both field growing and on harvest and pack, this is what I did. In my mind, I went through the whole set of crops, assigning time spent either growing or harvesting and packing on each. After that process, I still had 1,000 hours of field growing activity and 1,500 hours left of harvest activity that I couldn't attribute to any one particular crop. So I put those numbers into cells K8 and K11. These field growing and these harvest and pack hours that aren't assigned to a crop will later be allocated by Veggie Compass to each vegetable cost based on the relative acreage of the crops grown. This is an effort to force each crop to carry some of the weight of all that generic time spent getting things done on the farm. Obviously, the goal is to accurately assign as much labor expense to a crop as possible, but it's not possible to assign all hours to crops, so this handy calculation is part of the Veggie Compass system. I know this sheet will require a good bit of guessing until you start keeping records that will provide you with more exact information. While I've explained some of the shortcuts I've used, it's important to remember that you still have to make sure that the total hours you assign are real. So when you think you've finished entering all the data, add up the cells F107, that's your field growing labor, plus H107, your harvest and pack labor, plus all the hours over here in the blue boxes K5, K8, and K11, and make sure they add up to the total number of hours that you believe were actually worked on the farm. Before we leave this sheet, look over here to cell K4 in yellow, and you'll see an interesting calculation. Veggie Compass has taken the data from this production input sheet and from the expense input sheet and come up with a figure that represents the full average cost of production labor per hour on your farm. This number includes taxes, insurance, benefits, and all the things that a grower might forget are actually part of having workers, like providing lunches or dinners or snacks. Many of us think that our labor bill is only the cost of the hourly wage that we advertise that we pay our workers, like $10 an hour. This hourly labor figure here in yellow is only for production labor. It doesn't include management labor or marketing labor. This actual production labor cost per hour is a valuable number for you to have in your mind as you think about what any one farm activity might be costing you. For example, we have a morning meeting each day. Let's say 10 people are at that meeting and the meeting lasts for 20 minutes. This meeting is costing me about $45. Is that a good investment? Well, you can answer that for your farm. My answer is a resounding yes, because I know that that meeting is how everybody gets their assignments for the day and how they put their minds on the farm so that they'll work efficiently. Once we start looking at the next sheet to see how Veggie Compass has calculated the actual costs of production by crop, it becomes easier to see that with a more realistic hourly labor cost in mind, you can answer management questions like this. Is it really cost-effective to spend an hour to wash this muddy basket of turnips? Okay, that's the end of the hard work. Now comes the fun part, seeing what Veggie Compass does with all of this information and what we can learn from it. Join us next for a demonstration of the Veggie Compass cost of production by crop sheet when we actually start learning what it is costing us to produce each crop on our farms.